We went through as much of it as we could and saw how completely unfair this process was. We object publicly and loudly as we can on behalf of Michael Brown Jr.'s family that this process is broken.
By now, most everyone has absorbed the first interview with Darren Wilson, the soon-to-be former police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, who shot and killed Michael Brown in what he and others call an act of self-defense while performing his duties. Granted, there are plenty who will take umbrage with that statement. But the grand jury heard the evidence and has spoken clearly. What is not so clear, of course, are the various incorrect assumptions and opinions about what we take into the stage of ensuring this never happens again. It's a tough job, but let's welcome to MidPoint one more than up to the task. From the Philadelphia law firm of O'Brien and Ryan and the MidPoint legal eagle, if you will, Heather Hansen joins us again from New York. Heather, thanks for joining us, and I'm glad you made it through the weather.
Me too. It is nasty out there, but I'm happy to be here.
Always good as long as you're not snowed in. Let's get right to what Benjamin Crump said, the attorney there. Unfair is the word we're hearing. We're also hearing that after hearing what the grand jury heard, hearing some of the stuff, reading it as well, that there were inconsistencies overall and many things that are still left unsaid and unexamined, if you will. You've had a chance to look at this. From a strict legal opinion, as you look at it, give us your take on what the grand jury said.
The grand jury had so much to look at, Ed. You know, when we talk just in generalities about 70 hours of testimony, 70 days rather, then we start to get sort of dismissive of it. But as I was reading through the thousands of pages, there's so much of it that was boring. There's so much of it, I mean, hundreds of pictures that they were looking at and just being identified. Ultimately, this grand jury heard every word, saw every bit of evidence, and came to a conclusion based on that evidence and the law. So to say that this was unfair really does them a disservice. I have to say that their statements were often preserved for the record, and they were well aware of the fact that people were impatient for their decision and that their decision would be looked at closely. And despite that, they continued to work hard. I'm sure that it was a heart-wrenching decision that they had to make, but they made the appropriate one given the facts and the law.
Heather, let's get down then to Robert McCullough. We just saw a couple of pictures of him, the St. Louis County prosecutor. There are those insisting that simply because he does business with the police every single day, that he was trying to aim this. He was trying to, quote unquote, fix it, if you will, and that he should have called for a special prosecutor. What's your take there?
You know, before this started, I had been asked whether or not they should call for a special prosecutor, and I actually thought it was a good idea because I felt as though every possible opportunity to give some seed to the other side would be helpful in the argument that this was fair. But at some point, you have to stop bending over backwards. The truth is, with this type of case and this type of evidence, had there not been all the media attention, most prosecutors, in my opinion, would not have pursued the case at all. The fact that it went to the grand jury, I think, was to give everyone the idea that all of this evidence would be public, that a jury of the peers would listen to the evidence, and that it would go forward. But McCullough really attempted to put it all out there. The fact that they released this grand jury information the night that the decision was released is unheard of. So all of this was to help support the idea that what they did here was fair. I think, Ed, ultimately, no matter what they did, whether there was a special prosecutor, whether this went to trial and there was an innocent verdict, no matter what happened, there would be some who would claim that the process was unfair.
Let me repeat that before we take a break. 20 seconds left here. Then you feel that if this had gone to a standard jury trial, that the results would be the same looking at the evidence?
Absolutely.
And that's what many people are saying, that perhaps if there had been cross-examination, it might have brought up other things. But aren't we then just looking at theatrics?
Well, and the reality is the grand jurors they have the opportunity to ask questions. Their questions were in many ways cross-examination. They were wonderful, telling, pointed questions that got a lot of the answers that cross-examination would get.
All right, now stand by. We'll return for another time with legal expert Heather Hansen. More on what we now know from the Ferguson grand jury, what questions remain, but also what about future trials? This is MidPoint, where every day we question everything. Let's welcome back to MidPoint from the Philadelphia law firm of O'Brien and Ryan LLP. Our legal eagle, Heather Hansen, joins us. Heather, let's get down now to other lawsuits out of what's happened in Ferguson here, because everybody is now talking about the Justice Department getting involved and a civil rights lawsuit. Do you see anything here indicated in this evidence that we have that would indicate any basis for a civil rights lawsuit?
No, Ed, the standard for a civil rights lawsuit is so much higher. There has to be proof of an intentional violation. Against Officer Wilson, it would have to be proof of an intentional violation of Brown's constitutional rights. That standard is so much higher. You know, we saw with the Zimmerman case, there was talk of a federal lawsuit, and that still has not been closed. I think the same thing will happen here. I think that there will be a long delay, perhaps in the hopes that tempers will die down, and then a decision as to whether or not this will actually go forward. It would be very difficult to bring a case against Wilson. Maybe a little less so to bring a case against the Ferguson Police Department. They would have to establish that there has been a practice of behaviors that infringe upon people's constitutional rights. But it was interesting in the transcripts, they asked the jurors, the grand jurors asked one of the police officers, have you had an officer involved shooting, not killing, just shooting in the past 10 years. And it's only been 1 or 2. So that in and of itself is an interesting piece of evidence. But that's what the DOJ is examining, not just Wilson, but the entire police department. Is there something here that we can go after and change?
What about the possibility of a civil suit by the Brown family against the officer?
It's going to be very difficult. First of all, there's the question of immunity. Police officers acting within their course of their duties have qualified immunity for the most part. Secondly, it is really, you know, a civil lawsuit is not beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not the standard. The standard is a preponderance of the evidence, which really means, is it more likely than not that Officer Wilson is liable? That's a similar standard to what the grand jury had here. So sure, I believe the family will probably try to pursue such a thing, but if Officer Wilson decides to defend it rather than to settle it and move on with his life, I think he would win that as well. Listen, the evidence is very, very telling. The physical evidence supports Officer Wilson's version of the facts. It does not support, for example, the friend, that Dorian Johnson, his version of the facts. It's just not consistent with the physical evidence that just doesn't lie.
To that end, is possibly one of the most distressing things here from a legal standpoint is how the various media outlets have continued to characterize this and how they are leaving out facts in the case. For instance, I don't think, except on this show, I don't think we have heard again about the fact that Michael Brown was involved in an alleged strong-arm robbery that started this whole thing in motion.
Well, and it's one of the things, it's so frustrating, to answer your question, because all these people who are commenting on it, including, in my opinion, some of the lawyers who represent some of the parties, haven't read the whole transcript. It is boring in parts, but it is fascinating in other parts. And the jurors were very interested in that robbery. The jurors were very interested. They were asking the friend who was with Michael Brown, why didn't you walk on the sidewalk? And when the officer asked you to move to the sidewalk, why didn't you just go? Those were questions from the jurors. Those weren't questions from the prosecutors. The jurors were very thoughtful with what they said. So to hear people on media just taking sentences and not respecting these jurors in the process is very frustrating.
We never hear the word alleged anymore when it comes down to opining on a lot of these things, do we?
No, no. And it's, you know, if I can read you just one sentence from one of the jurors
Got
who
about
was
20
there,
seconds. Go ahead.
He said, people keep saying, why don't they just arrest him and then figure out what's going on? Is there a way to bypass this? Because it seems to me that we're doing what needs to be done and we're doing what's right and people aren't seeing that. That's a juror speaking, and I think that's best said.
And that is indeed best said, because we're going to be talking about this for a while and tearing this all apart. But it's always fascinating. As I say, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV, and that's why I let you do it on TV on a regular basis. Heather Hansen, pleasure to have you on the show again. Thanks for making the trip today. Please, a very happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
You too, Ed. Take care.
You too. We'll see you next week. Next hour here on MidPoint, the politician who promises he will do everything in his power to defang Obamacare. Body language from Ferguson. And a very special appetizer for your Thanksgiving holiday. It's coming up right here on MidPoint.